group if it's currently live.
Hello, everyone. Glad you could join us tonight. We're going to wait a few minutes to let a few more people join us. And my name is Selvin Chambers, and I'm here as part of the Justice for Yuri Stamps Senior Group. So welcome.
Norman Miller said, I can't hear anything, but I think, Norman, that's because nobody's saying anything yet, but we're about to get started.
Hi, I'll say something. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Elaine.
Hi.
Hello, I'm William Labarge.
Actually, if folks wouldn't mind, maybe you could put in the chat your name and if you're affiliated with a group or where you're from, that would be super.
That'll be much easier because we will have a lot of people on tonight to do verbal introductions of who's online with us.
Right. And Stephanie and Jim, you can hear now, is that right, I hope?
So perhaps whoever feels comfortable sharing their information can put it in the chat, and if not, that's okay. I know Ashley has a document that you can put in your information to get on the mailing list through the Facebook group. Just again, because of the topic that we will be discussing and the fact that it's public, some folks may not feel comfortable doing that.
I'm putting the email sign up for our group in the chat.
We're going to give it another minute.
In the next 4 or 5 weeks. And they're all complicated. They all have.
People are going. The women's group.
Ashley, I'm going to ask you to mute everyone except for those that are speaking.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful people, we're going to end the silence. Good evening. My name is Selvin Chambers, and I'm here with the group Justice for Yuri Stamps. And we're here to share information as it pertains to police brutality and really have a conversation about racism, police reform, and strategies for making change in this country in light of all that has been going on the past several months and systemically for years as it pertains to racism and police brutality. And I want to say, as a member of the Justice for Yuri Stamps group, we speak for the Justice of Yuri Stamps group. We do not speak on behalf of the family of Yuri Stamps. And we do have a family member who will be joining us today. I'm going to ask you all, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We intentionally muted everyone except for the panelists due to the fact that we can't have a free-for-all and have about 100 people speaking. And so those of you who have friends who couldn't get in and they're texting you or calling you, let them know this will be broadcast on Facebook Live as we speak. And again, this will be a formal conversation. Let me contextualize a little bit about the Yuri Stamps group. And we came together back in June when we were looking at what happened to the issue of George Floyd. And it was near and dear to an issue that happened to us in January of 2011, when Mr. Yuri Stamps Sr. was at home watching a basketball game in his pajamas, and a SWAT team had knocked on the door with a nonviolent search warrant. And they weren't looking for Mr. Stamps. And during this raid, Mr. Stamps was shot in the head by Officer Paul Duncan. And at the time, the district attorney at the time of Middlesex County deemed it an accident without lots of information and a thorough investigation. And this group, when we galvanized together in June, we were able to meet with Marion Ryan, who is the Middlesex district attorney, and who has assured us that she will be reinvestigating the issue that we have addressed around the murdering of Mr. Stamps Sr. We want people to understand that Mr. Stamps is just one of hundreds of people who have been murdered at the hands of the police. And the sole purpose of this conversation is not just about Mr. Stamps Sr., it's really about the hundreds of other lives that have been lost. I want to thank our partners who come together to help support this mass action, who we have a member on the panel, and ACLU of Massachusetts, who they are also part of the panel. And when the panelists get introduced, you'll hear a little bit more about those two organizations. And to contextualize about Mr. Stamps, I would like to introduce Mariah Wilkins, who is the granddaughter of Mr. Yuri Stamps Sr. Mariah.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I just have to give another thank you and thanking God for the Justice for Yuri Stamps group. They've been so committed to this cause. The organizers, the supporters of our family, sincere gratitude to you all for championing this, because it takes a real heart and passion and gift to do and fight for other people, especially when they sometimes can't fight for themselves. So I just want to start off by just, as someone said, my name is Mariah Wilkins, and I am one of the 14 grandchildren of Yuri Stamps. Loved him dearly, but my grandfather, he may be absent from this natural world, but we know that his spirit lives on, and he lives on through us every day. And we choose to honor him in the most positive way that we can, which is how we live our lives. I'd like to just start by saying that my grandfather showed me the importance of family. He showed me the importance of unity and community. And knowing that, you know, to show up matters, and to do what you love unapologetically matters, but most importantly, being a good person matters. He imparted to me how to use my voice and how to make your presence known through character and through love and work and laughter. None of us would be gathered here today in this forum if it wasn't for the unparalleled life that my grandfather led. And he was a living sacrifice, and his life was taken in sacrifice for so many reasons and so many revelations after we realized. But to say the least, unfortunately, many people lose their lives to police brutality. Some of you may be on here, may know of some who's near and distant, but this conversation still involves you, and this issue still impacts you. And I would say, for those of you who are listening who have grandparents that are still living, or are a grandparent yourself, it's to really impart your story, to listen to their story and to carry it forward. I see this country in a lot of ways differently because of the perspective my grandfather afforded me. And I always think of where was he in his life when certain issues happened and how did he respond? And you all have that same choice today. How are you responding to police brutality that's happening? I want to just maybe welcome you as you guys listen to the wonderful speakers that are coming forward with formal conversation and information, to remind you that this does include you. And I want to remind you that this is a part of the work that we're doing. And change starts with a conversation, and a conversation leads to change. Change starts with a conversation, and conversation leads to change. And I want to stop and pause for a minute and invite you all to just think on the very fact of what does a conversation mean? What does it do? And it is to impart and interchange information. And that's what we're doing here today. We're obtaining information. We are gathering new levels of understanding, empathy, ideas. We're being challenged to shift and think differently and to imagine possibilities and look at problems and look at solutions as well. Before I close, I always want to act. This is an action of what we believe to make change. And the conversation, I want you guys to do three things, or welcome you to do three things. One, pay attention. Paying attention involves deep listening, active listening, taking notes. Two, draw your life in comparison to what you hear. Draw your timeline. Think of how this information could be anchored or relative to your life. And three, I just ask for or welcome feedback. Any questions, anything that probes you, anything that irritates you, this is the kind of feedback that kind of shifts us. And as I said before, change starts with the conversation, and conversation does lead to change. I thank you all so much for being in here. Rest in peace, Yuri Stamps, the greatest man I will ever know. Thanks again.
Thank you for that, Mariah. Thank you. A round of applause for you. And your grandfather was a great guy. I had the opportunity to know him personally. And I tell people all the time, when Mr. Stamps was around, I felt two things. I felt safe and I felt held accountable, right? And those are two things that most people should cherish, to be held accountable, but also to feel safe. And as we have this conversation, unfortunately, a lot of the lives that have lost, they weren't safe. And unfortunately, those on the other end, in most cases, weren't held accountable. So this is going to be an open discussion about those issues. So my role is to introduce the moderator, who I'm not going to go into. She's Dr. Patricia Sanchez Conley, who is associate professor at Framingham State, who has a fascinating story of her own as an immigrant, as a parent, and also as someone who started a nonprofit to address these type of issues, which I'll have her talk about in a little bit. And most importantly of all to me, I feel honored to call her and her husband, my friends. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Patricia Sanchez Conley, associate professor from Framingham State University, to facilitate the conversation.
Thank you, Selvin. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Mariah, for sharing all those words with us. We're very proud to be here and humbled to be in this space with all these people who are here because of your grandfather, and to learn about how we can move forward and stop the violence. My name, like Selvin said, is Patricia Sanchez Connolly. I am an immigrant from El Salvador. I am a mother to 2 Black children, and I am an associate professor, mentor, friend, and advocate for many students, many of whom are here today at Framingham State University. I also co-founded the Anti-Racism Coalition in Dedham after the incident with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd earlier in the summer. And so we have been doing some work here in Dedham as well. My job tonight is to bring in our panelists and conduct a conversation, which hopefully I will try my best to ask questions and keep everyone engaged. We will have a Q&A at around 6:30 or so. And so Michael will be taking a look at the chat. So if people would like to post questions in the chat, you're welcome to do that. And if you would like to speak, you could please raise your hand. We will wait until the Q&A unless there are any questions that cannot wait. So the first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our panelists. As I introduce each panelist, I would like them to please just take 2 minutes to say a little bit about their work. We do have 2 folks representing 2 different organizations. And so if Brock and Rasan can talk about what their organization does, that would be also great. So I will go ahead and start with Selvin Chambers, who is an activist and community organizer, and is one of the co-leaders for the Justice for Yuri group. Selvin is a business development leader, a visionary, and a motivational speaker. He is also a civic and social justice activist who was raised in Cambridge and has lived in many other parts in the United States. He has worked in the field of youth development, nonprofit management, community engagement, higher education, civic activism, and social justice. And so if we could welcome Selvin, and you can tell us a little bit about some of your other work within this organization.
Well, I joined this organization at the hands of, and I would be remiss to not give credit to Ashley and Royce Harding. This conversation, as it talks about social justice for Yuri Stamps Sr., started at their kitchen table, and then it galvanized the rest of us. I've had the pleasure of being able to travel and live in this country. I'm a sociologist by trade, that's my background, and have run several nonprofits and also worked in city government as well. But also growing up in a housing development in Cambridge, I've got to see firsthand some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. And so I made it my life's mission to make sure that I'm trying to carve out a better space and a place for other people so we don't have to continually talk about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you, Selvin. Mr. Rasan Hall is the director of the Racial Justice Program at ACLU, Massachusetts. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and the organization that you work for, please.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm humbled to be a part of this conversation, although I did not know Mr. Stamps. The ACLU was certainly involved in challenging a ruling in a lower court when the family sought justice in the aftermath of his killing. And so I became familiar with him then. The work I do now, however, as the director of the Racial Justice Program is really focused on leveraging the legislative and litigation and organizing resources of the ACLU to address civil rights and civil liberties violations, particularly in communities of color. For over 100 years, the ACLU has fought in the courts, in the legislature, and in communities to defend people's civil rights and civil liberties. And so my role for the Massachusetts affiliate is to extend that work into communities of color, and that includes criminal law reform, police accountability, prosecutorial accountability, and other issues that impact communities of color, like voting rights and education. So pleased to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We have Dr. Zeynep Gonen. She is an assistant professor in the sociology department at Framingham State University. She teaches courses such as crime and inequality, critical issues in policing, and global criminology. Dr. Gonen, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your work and research?
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, I'm Zeynep Gonen. I teach at Framingham State University, and I focus my research and my interest is really has been studying police from historical and comparative perspective. I'm originally from Turkey, and I came to study issues of prisons and policing. And when I came to the United States in 2002, that was a time when these things were really being, we were really focused. And then I started to think about my own country and started to think comparatively with respect to what was going on in the United States and in Turkey, and started to look at these things both historically and from around the world. So it allowed me to, then make a research based on the Turkish police and things that are happening in Turkey, which are quite similar in many respects. And I then have continued to expand on this comparative approach, which I hope that will also help me contribute to this conversation. And that is the thing that I would like to bring in here, this comparative and historical approach, which gives me a really critical approach to what police is and how the police brutality and racism is in fact inherent elements and systemic elements of policing. So this is actually the start for me in a way to what I would like to say, but yeah, this is what I have been doing.
Thank you so much. She is also a great colleague to work with. And then last but not least is Mr. Brock Satter. He is the co-founder and organizer of the Mass Action Against Police Brutality, which was established in March of 2015 during the uprising sparked by the Ferguson Rebellion over the police murder of Michael Brown Jr. Brock, if you would like to unmute and tell us a little bit more about yourself and your organization.
I believe we may have just lost.
Oh. Hey, sorry, y'all. Yeah, it's dropped off for a sec. Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we're good, bro.
Okay, good. Yeah, my name is Brock Satter. I'm representing Mass Action Against Police Brutality. First off, I really want to thank the Yuri Stamps group for organizing this. I believe it's a sign of the times, as well as our organization, Mass Action, I believe is a sign of the times. We were formed 6 years ago around in the wake of the protest that swept the nation after Mike Brown Jr. was killed in Ferguson and the rebellion in Ferguson. And we've never stopped. And with our movement, our group, we've sought to collaborate and work with all victims of police brutality and their supporters to put their demands at the center of this protest movement. And those demands are pretty uniform. Any family you meet across the country, the main concern that they all want is justice for what was done to their loved ones by the hands of the state. And all of them have encountered, a very dug-in situation where, the government that's supposed to, represent us is covering up its crimes and justifying these killings. And I would say it's not just hundreds, it's thousands, if not tens of thousands of families across the country that face this. And in any case, just to briefly explain some of my background, with this group started 6 years ago, but I go way back in this fight. The case that shook me to my core and changed the way I view this country was Rodney King. I was living in New York during the Amadou Diallo. Familiar with many cases across the country, some known, most unknown. What we're trying to do with mass action is really, defend the interests of the families, which we think is really the interests of the people as a whole. And unfortunately, this protest movement, which I believe we're in a historical moment, which was opened up 6 years ago with the Ferguson Rebellion, where basically we have a mass movement around this issue that's been a problem for decades. and longer. We have an opportunity now to solve it, but it's always been the case that these are political cases, and it's not really a question of the law, in my opinion. It's a question of political will, and the mass movement is the only reason why we're discussing this now. It's the only reason why the Yuri Stamps group formed, I would imagine. It's definitely the only reason we were able to pull together the mass action against police brutality group, is that there's a growing and widespread questioning in this country about the nature of the government, the nature of the police and the judicial system, and a disillusionment in the government, including both main parties, the Democrat and Republican Party, to solve these questions. That's part of the issue too, that it's a bipartisan attack on the rights of the people that is happening in red states and blue states, and with officials who have the power to address this from both parties that are not acting on it. And that's what's opening a huge political chasm in this country, and it's being filled by a mass movement that is not the claim of any political party. It's a claim. It's the property of the people. It's the property of truth and justice, and it's very encouraging that it's announced itself on the political scene. We don't believe it's going anywhere, and we believe that we've only scratched the surface. It's being filled by a movement. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So thank you for getting us started actually on the conversation. What we would like to do next is we do have a few questions that we will ask our panelists. And if possible, we'd like to keep each response to 3 to 5 minutes the most, so that everyone can have an opportunity to speak, and also so we can get through the questions and have some time for the Q&A. I did kind of go through, and depending on what you all described as your background, figured which questions I should ask which speakers. However, if there's stuff that you would like to say as a panelist, feel free to just jump in. So the first question, which again, Brock was starting to talk about, and I guess I'd like to follow up with Rasan, is we know that Massachusetts is not exempt to police brutality. We know that we are not immune to deaths among specifically Black men in the Black community. And so what is the number and scope of incidents in Massachusetts? And does police brutality happen in Massachusetts? Where? What do those numbers look like, if you know, Rasan?
Sure. Well, there's no actual accounting of all of the police killings of civilians, but in the last 10 years, there have been over 115 recorded incidents. The ACLU of Massachusetts just launched, or not just launched, but launched several weeks ago, a campaign called Police Violence Happens Here, as an attempt to push back against the narrative of policing, that it is overwhelmingly safe and productive, and that it helps communities. When you look at the number of incidents, many of them are incidents where it is not justified, where individuals were either unarmed, or the police used excessive force that led to a death. And so, if folks are interested in seeing more, I just dropped in the chat a link to that site that shows where the incidents were, and some of a brief description of what those incidents were. And so it's really unfortunate that these things continue to happen. And that's just within the last 10 years. I was just looking at an article today that talked about 10 notorious incidents in the city of Boston where police officers killed unarmed teenagers, dating back to the 1970s up through the 1990s. And with all of them, or not with all of them, but not surprisingly, there was a significant disparity along racial lines. Of the 9 that had been shot and killed by the police, 5 of them were Black, 3 were Latinx, and 2 were white, I believe, or 1 was white. So the trends that we saw then continue.
Thank you. So we know that nationally, the trend of fatal police shootings seems to only be increasing. As of October 30th, 2020, there were 809 civilians having been shot, and about 157 of them were Black. So we know that there's, a disproportionate rate number of Black men specifically being killed. This question is for Selvin and for Dr. Gonen. Why Black men? Could you please address the racial aspect of this brutality and excessive force?
Well, historically, Black men have been considered like the underclass, right? The least valued and least appreciated. And if you look at the history of the development of our policing system, it started in slavery, right? It was purposely to go get slaves and lock them up. Not a lot has changed through that system. Now we're about 13% of the entire population in the country, Black people of color, Black, I'm talking about people, African Americans or Black people, but we're almost half of the population in prison. I'm just talking about Black males, right? And there's something systemically wrong with that. And if you even look at the police system, how even deeper than that, 41% of the population are white women. So you got Black males and white women who are in jail. And the reality is that, when you have a system that really hasn't addressed its policies in regards to how people are treated, is fundamentally the major part of the problem. Having these protests are really important to really highlight the issues, right? But we have to, at some point, move beyond just a protest and then move from protest to policy. To me, they go hand in hand. And unfortunately, in this country, the Black male is the endangered species because it's the least valued and the least appreciated. And so that's my take on it.
I mean, I will follow up with Selvin's in the sense that, the police institution, the modern police institution in its origin has been founded in order to discipline certain groups of people. First, it was established in Europe in 1800s, and it was to control the working classes and discipline them, mostly poor people. And in the United States, it was also the case, but also the United States is also, in terms of its enslaved populations, had a different problem that it had to contain too, and it was Black people. And US policing has its origins both in trying to control poor immigrant working class populations, but also the enslaved populations. And thus, from the origins, from the beginnings, US policing was racist, US policing was classist, and police institution itself was about all this. And this hasn't changed, as Selvin has said. It changed shapes. It tried to be reformed. It tried to be turned into something like crime fighting and trying to protect. However, we see that these are still like certain, in some ways, myths that we keep on believing that police serves and protects everybody, that police fights crime, but most of the time we still end up with this picture where police disproportionately uses force on Black people, not only Black men, but also Black women too. I think we should also acknowledge this too. It is not just Black men, definitely disproportionately. But Black women also are targets of police use of force, excessive use of force. Black people, communities are not given the same kind of protection, are neglected or over-policed. So the whole long history of policing is based upon this disproportionate or discriminatory system. So it is in that sense, within that long history, we have to understand what is going on right now, where we have, Black people being subject to 2 times more use of force by the police, or unarmed Black men are possibly 5 times more likely to be killed by the police. So it is, I think, in this historical long-term thing that we have to look at. But I also would like to say, yes, policing has its own function, I think, is connected to this racism and also keeping hierarchies in our societies. But also in the United States, Black people has been criminalized in so many ways, both by the discourses, the media, the politicians, since the end of slavery, and during the slavery too, but after the slavery, their existence in the society has been criminalized by the ideologies and then by the mass incarceration system, which put many Black people in the jails, then kind of give us a picture that as if all these people were actually criminals. The kind of strategies like war on drugs, like focusing extensively on certain kinds of communities have created this problem, but then also justified the criminalization process that Black people has been having. Thus, they have been established as the dangerous populations, as the people who are criminal that police should be paying attention to and using force towards. In that sense, the long history and the ideologies as well as policies that created this are very important to address in really understanding why Black men or why Black people are the targets.
Thank you, Dr. Gonen. That's a great perspective. Actually, to follow up on your response there, I'm wondering whether you could talk to us a little bit about the global aspect of what goes on here in the United States. What is different or unique about the United States and what happens here with the Black community?
United States is an exception and not an exception at the same time. First of all, police forces everywhere has followed the similar origin. You know, they all were created to establish a certain kind of order, especially if that order was unequal and exploitative, then that police forces were also effective or tried to keep that unjust orders in all parts of the world. But coming to today, what we see is, yes, US is unexceptional, especially when we compare it to many countries around the world, which are mostly undemocratic and has authoritarian tendencies and has quite a lot of inequalities in their context. And these countries have unleashed police brutality against their own citizens. Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, Philippines, Turkey, many countries experience similar kinds of problems. Maybe in terms of the death rates that police creates, Brazil is a comparative one. Around 2,000 or 1,000 to 2,000 people are being killed every year there, more than United States, yet very extensive. So US is not exceptional in that sense. And in terms of the racism also, US is not exceptional because police in different parts of the world also puts more force on racialized poor populations. However, when we look at, for instance, in Europe, which we would normally compare US with because they are more wealthy and more have more advanced democracies, so-called, right? So in those societies, we see less police brutality. The amount of use of force by the police in many European countries are very little compared to US. So in that comparison, we see US being an exception. This wealthy democracy, the advanced capitalist country, is actually in comparison to similar other countries are quite a different case. So there are things that could explain this, the gun ownership, the existence violence in the society, but also I have to also still, think about the extensive inequalities and the way in which the governments in the United States tries to solve its problems. It might be one of the reasons. But I would like to still say that even in Europe, we cannot say that there is no police brutality and there is no racism. On the contrary, in many of these contexts, while we don't see too many police killings, we see the similar kind of racist police actions, especially against African and Arab migrants, migrants who are not like white Europeans. And that's why maybe the Black Lives Matter movement have resonated, if you have followed, have resonated with many parts of the world because it is a very similar dynamic. Police in many parts of the world is doing the similar thing like the United States. So both an exception and not an exception at all.
Thank you. It's definitely interesting to hear about the global, impact that Black Lives Matter has had, because again, it's really important. So bringing it back to kind of statewide though, I'd like to hear from Brock and Rasan, if you could please tell us a little bit about the, what is the legislative reform bill and where is it at this point?
So currently, in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, people took to the streets, and the Massachusetts legislature attempted to respond to that. The Senate put forth a very robust criminal police reform bill, and then the House put forth a similarly robust, but in some respects less effective, in some respects more effective bill than the Senate. In Massachusetts, our legislative session is usually 18 months from January to July 31st of the following year. So sometime in late July, a conference committee was enacted to reconcile the differences between the two bills. And, you know, July 27th through July 31st wasn't going to be enough time to reconcile a bill like that. And so currently, the legislative session has been extended to the end of the year to deal with that policing bill, but several other matters as well, including the budget. And so where it stands right now is the conference committee is still negotiating the bill. There are a couple of issues within the bill that are key sticking points that are holding this thing up from what we've been able to glean as advocates. So one of the concerns is the creation of a post commission or a peace officer standards and training. And essentially what that is a decertification regime that certifies police officers, and then in the event of misconduct or the commission of a crime, the officers would be decertified. And the value of that is that if an officer is engaged in misconduct, they can either retire or resign rather before they're terminated, or if they are terminated, there's nothing that stops them from going and getting hired at another law enforcement organization. What decertification allows or does is that it prevents officers from going from one department to another, because there's a registry that is created to prevent officers from moving around like that. Massachusetts is only one of 4 states that does not have decertification or a post system. The sticking point on that, because the governor, the speaker, the Senate president, they all agree that we should have some sort of post system, is the composition of the commission. Advocates want majority civilians to make up that commission, but not just any civilians. We want civilians who are people who either come from over-policed communities or who have experienced, police violence, police misconduct, or who are engaged in police accountability work. So that's the huge sticking point there. I think also, what is the threshold to begin an investigation? Is there a standard of proof that must be met for this commission to begin an investigation? Our position is you shouldn't have a threshold to investigate something. Just start investigating. Now, to proceed, then I think you need to have a higher standard. So that's the other thing. The other significant sticking point on this bill is the limits on qualified immunity. And qualified immunity, for those who are unfamiliar, is a legal doctrine that protects public employees, which police officers are, from civil liability, unless the plaintiff or the person who is bringing the lawsuit can show that the officer who conducted the misconduct or violated a person's rights, that their conduct was clearly established as a violation of the law. And unfortunately, the way that the courts have interpreted this is that absent there being a case where another officer did the exact same thing or something very similar, and the court in that prior case said that that was a violation of law, then the courts determined that it's not clearly established. And so all of the time officers are protected from civil liability. So those are two of the sticking points. My sense is that sometime around or before Thanksgiving, the bill will be released, and then it'll be voted on by both the House and Senate, and then signed by the governor if all things go.
Oh, I guess I'd like to, Brock, I'd like to ask you this to kind of follow up on this question. Can you tell us a little bit more about whether there are cities or towns in Massachusetts that are making changes now in their policing, and how that's going?
Well, just on that, I mean, I appreciate Rashawn's comments on this because we haven't really been focusing on the legislative measures. We just want to enter into this whole discussion debate that a lot of this isn't really about legislation. It's about district attorneys deciding to indict police who've committed crimes and their refusal to do so. And oftentimes their complicity in covering this up, as seen in the Ahmaud Arbery case or some other prominent cases, that political pressure through the mass movement, through these protests, uh, to see how many of these police officers are taken to trial even for the crimes they commit. That's why the formation of the Yuri Stamps Group, I believe, is so important. There's no statute of limitations on murder. One of the main demands that we've been raising in conjunction with hundreds of families across the country is to reopen all past cases of police brutality. So we've been raising that. Apparently, in the state of Massachusetts, neither the governor nor the attorney general seem to know who has the power to step in and reopen a case if a district attorney refuses to do so. So I would say if you take that metric, very few municipalities or counties are taking steps. These police officers are not being prosecuted. We've been working with the family of Terrence Coleman in Boston, the family of Bo Ramsey White in Boston, Ross Batista, and as I see, I think on this call right now is the family of Justin Root, who was just killed last year, or actually earlier this year in February, are demanding that they at least get a trial to determine whether or not a crime has been committed, and let the trial decide, let the trial body decide, and not the district attorney to have the final say. So we want to introduce that idea. A lot of people believe, or have come to believe, because this has been the pattern up until recently, that when somebody's killed by the police, they drag out the investigation. Usually it's not really serious. They wait till tempers die down, and they say there's nothing to look at here, case closed. And then people think, well, that's the end of the story. But it's always been a legal avenue in pretty much every state, I believe, even those with grand juries, that cases can be reopened. This is a political decision not to investigate. The burden of proof, or the role of the prosecutor is not to be the trial body, but to determine whether or not there's enough probable cause to search whether or not a crime is committed. That's the role of the trial. And that's not what's being done. They're trying to use these, trying to pretend like these grand juries are trial bodies. That's what you see in Kentucky right now around the Breonna Taylor case. And this is why the role of the mass movement is more important. There's no legislation that's going to make the attorney general indict those officers. But now, because of the scrutiny of the public, some of the steps that he took are starting to unravel. And that's the challenge that remains. We believe we don't believe it's time to come off the streets. We believe we're only scratching the surface of the social protests around this, and that's the best way we're going to make progress is to maintain public and political pressure. So I don't know if that
Thank you so much.
helped, but I wanted to throw that into the debate because this is central.
Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Gonen, and I guess whoever of the panelists would like to jump in. What does it mean when we say or hear defunding the police, and what do you think our society would look like when and if that happens?
First, I would like to agree with Brock's, suggestion that mass movements, political movements, and pressure is the most important way that we actually can create change in this, especially in these kinds of subjects. And one of the things that the last wave of Black Lives Matter movement brought us and brought into the conversation is defunding the police arguments, right? And these weren't necessarily so mainstream ideas that actually are more rest on the activism that is around abolishing prisons and police. And this is a practical way of imagining a society and finding a society that doesn't rely on police and prisons to solve its problems, basically. In this society in the United States, the police has been expanding and expanding to intervene and to try to solve all kinds of problems that we have: the mental health issues, the family issues, the little disruptions in the society. Everything has been tried to be resolved through the institution of the police. And defund the police movement is trying to say that, okay, if we have police institution to deal with some important violent situations, it might be okay, but why do we keep on funding an institution that doesn't necessarily know how to deal with an array of different kinds of problems, and give all those, give the funds from the police, take the funds from the police and kind of put them on on the communities that really needs them, on the services that really needs them, on the kinds of solutions that doesn't necessarily involve violence and policing, but other kinds of solutions that can be much more humane and much less violent on people's lives. So defunding the police in that sense is trying to reduce the role of the society, role of the police in the society, while creating more conditions, creating funds, creating services for the communities that then would reduce some of the problems that police is trying to deal with. So how it looks like, I think it looks like a more just society in general, where where the communities have more resources. They think about the communities which are now being policed all the time would have more welfare services, more security in general, because now those resources that has been only given to police, more education, more healthcare, all these things that are necessary and that prevents violence and criminality would be the places that we would be spending money on, and that would actually that is the kind of imagination that defunding the police demands are creating. And they are suggesting that it is a practice towards abolition of the police. Maybe we will create a society at the end that we won't need the police forces. That is the kind of vision. So I think I really appreciate this Black Lives Matter movement's certain fractions. Not everybody is agreeing in the same direction, obviously, but it is important to see this vision and the importance of this vision and how it actually involves systemic changes and how we organize our society.
Thank you, Dr. Gonen. Selvin?
Yes, and to follow up on that, you asked earlier, are there departments that are taking initiative? And so when you think about the issue of defunding the police, I got to give credit to Commissioner Bard over in Cambridge, because he hasn't been asked to defund his department, but he's intentionally looked at his budget to see where he can reallocate funding to support the community. When people hear defund the police, they kind of interpret as take police off the streets. That's not what they're saying. The reality is, when you distribute the funding, right, you can put preventive measures in that block crime as opposed to being reactive. The police job is a reactive measure. Something's happened, they got to go. So the reallocation of funding really puts more money in the community to provide resources and support for the community in a preventive way.
Brock?
Yeah, just once again, I want to throw out, because this is a matter of debate. Because the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, that's a euphemism, but it's also organization, it's also a hashtag, and there's not some central leadership of this mass movement. I want to make the argument that the central demand of this movement is not to defund the police, but to prosecute the police, to put killer cops in jail, and that's the main measure that's going to affect police behavior. Now, I'm not against defunding the police. That's all well and good, but within the context of putting killer cops in jail, those that commit crimes should be put in jail. The question of, funding other aspects of, that are needed in society is not just a question of dealing with the police budget. I mean, it's not just the police. You have gated communities with private police. A lot of this has to do with the stratification of society in the hoarding of wealth among, a small minority of the population. That can also, that's where funds can also be gotten to address the social ills of the population as a whole. So it's not, those questions aren't solely a question of dealing with police budget. That's more dealing with society's distribution of wealth as a whole, which goes beyond the scope of even the current budget. But the question of changing and addressing why cops are killing people is because they're getting away with it. You can defund the police, but if you don't put killer cops in jail, they're not going to have any incentive not to continue killing people. So we're dealing with, and also I just want to raise that, yes, black people are definitely at the brunt of this, but in general, we're finding, it's a question of abuse of power. And when they kill white victims, they also cover up. I know that we had the Justin Root family on. He can attest that he was shot 30 some times right here in Boston when he was pretty much defenseless on the ground. And that case has still not been prosecuted. So I want to throw that out that this protest movement, and if you ask any family, if you ask, I'm in regular contact with many families that you've heard of, Samaria Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, Mike Brown. Me and Hope Coleman went to Ferguson last year during the 5-year anniversary of the death of Mike Brown, at a time when the mass movement had died off. But they're demanding that case be reopened. They haven't got justice, and to me, that's we would be doing a dramatic disservice to this movement if we lost the focus of what got us out on the streets anyway. If Derek Chauvin if he's not punished for the crimes that he committed, there's going to be another social explosion in this country.
Thank you. Ruslan, I'd like to ask whether you think, just to follow up with what the panelists were saying, are there other ways that this issue can be addressed systematically?
Well, I think to go back to the earlier point, the way that it's addressed systematically is through if not the entire abolition of police, certainly the reduction of the footprint of police. The types of reforms that are consistently considered are only going to tweak around the edges. As long as there's still law enforcement, there's going to be unjust, unlawful activities. They say that prohibition is the mother of invention or contravention, right? That people are going to work around the system. How many times have we heard about the overtime scandals in policing, yet to only find out that there's more overtime scandals in policing? How many wrongful convictions have we heard about? If anybody hasn't, I strongly encourage you to watch the Netflix documentary Trial 4. It reveals the depths of corruption and misconduct that happen within police departments. And so continuing to invest in a system that yields these types of results is a fool's errand. And I think when you look at the amount of money, and I think this is what lends credence to the defund argument, because when you look at the amount of money that is invested in policing in some of the most hardest hit communities, you could, and then you think about the results that we get. To Professor Chambers' point, like they're not preventing crime. They're responding to crime, but they're not preventing it. And so it's really about, and I say this as a former prosecutor. I served 8 years as a Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney, and I prosecuted all manner of crime. And what I understand is that a significant majority of what police end up spending their time on and what ends up coming into the courts are simple matters that could have been dealt with outside of the court. Yes, there is certainly violence that police respond to. Yes, there are certainly theft that police respond to, but the level of traffic enforcement that happens that disrupt people's lives, the matter of disputes that could have been resolved amicably without law enforcement, but the only tool that they have is the power of force and their arrest. And so we can put limits on use of force, like is being considered in this bill. We can get rid of qualified immunity, which is being considered in this bill. We can ban racist technologies like face surveillance technologies, which is also considered in this bill, and ban racial profiling, which is always all considered in this bill. Those are just some tweaks to reduce the harm that's happening. But to get to the core, and this goes back to Professor Gonen's point about the purpose of the institution in and of itself is about social control, particularly upon the most poor and disenfranchised and marginalized communities in our society. And as long as that is the structure that is in operation, we can have a kinder police department, but I don't want to be brutalized in a more kind way by police. So it's, for me, as an advocate, it's really about abolition. And to those who may think, well, you know, kind of abolition, that's ridiculous. Angela Davis once posited, like, there was a point in this time in this nation's country where people thought the abolition of slavery was ridiculous because it was a cornerstone of our national economies. So we just can't continue to do reforms and expect something different.
Thank you. So we do have a few minutes left before we open it up for the Q&A, and I do see that some folks have typed in some questions, which is great, and we will move on to that in a second. But the last question that I wanted to ask for to our panelists, and I want to start with Selvin, is what do you think what personal actions can people take in response to police brutality and excessive force in their own communities?
I think you got to do what the Hardings did, right? You got to galvanize people around what the issue is. And as you galvanize people, it's really important you get some experts at your table. So we've got lawyers, we got community activists, we've got family members, and you've got to do your research. You have to make sure you're doing your research and you have your facts right. And I think you have to be very persistent, right? You, as a group, we meet constantly. But again, this was fostered at the table of the Hardings. They called the number of people that they know. Half of us didn't know each other, you know, before June, and now we're interconnected, but we are very intentional in making sure that we have the right people. We're putting the pressure on, and we're constantly communicating with each other, but you have to take action. And I think I also challenge groups that, you know, when you gather, don't give up. Once your family member's issue is resolved, or your neighbor's issue is resolved, keep the pressure on. Do what Mass Action's doing, right? Keep the pressure on, and we have to move eventually into the policy stage, because policy and protest go hand in hand.
Would any one of the other panelists like to respond to that question? What personal actions can people take in response to police brutality in their own communities?
Yeah, I would like to respond to that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of like what Brother Selvin said. It is just create more awareness. You know, one of the problems a lot of families that I've talked to around the country raise is that oftentimes, you know, unless the victim is on TV, unless it's on national news, you know, you could have big protests, even including in this city. Like the biggest protests were not around the victims that were killed by the police here in this state. In this, you know, we need to know about the cases in your area. You need to, and then you need to hold it. If you want to get active and address what's going on with George Floyd, you know, you can't. There's only so much you can do from Massachusetts. But what we can do is we can put pressure on our DAs, our government, and help expose the crimes of the police that are being committed in our area. That's where we have the most. We can have the most direct impact. But a big part of this is, you know, the deep denial of the facts of how pervasive the problem is and how high up it goes. that's another thing I want to raise is, one of the examples we point to is the little Quan McDonald case in Chicago, where, this case was covered up by the entire city government. And it took a Freedom of Information request to release the dash cam video that proved that this brother Laquan McDonald was shot. He was unarmed. He shot 16 times. But the mayor was involved, Rahm Emanuel. The state attorney was involved, Anita Alvarez. The police superintendent was involved. The whole city council voted on this gag order settlement with the family so they wouldn't speak out on the case. And but it was eventually exposed by this video, which led to the officer finally being indicted. It was one of the few prosecutions of police that happened in the era between Mike Brown and George Floyd. And that shows that, it's not just the police we are up against. The only way they move so freely with what they do is they know they're being protected by the government. We're up against, prosecutors, we're up against judges, we're up against politicians. So if you want to defund the police, why stop there? Defund the judges, defund the prosecutors. They're all part of it. They're all in on it. So it's much deeper than simply tweaking the police. There's a big popular chant that came out of Ferguson: indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. We're up against the whole system, not just the police, but the entire government. Both parties, I might add, have backed this, and they have a very poor record. So just get involved where you can. Join the protest movements and spread the facts. Do your research, especially on the local cases in your area. Support those families. That's the main way you can really have an impact in your community. And collectively, if we do this nationally, it's going to be a watershed, and nothing can stop it.
Thank you. And I see that someone posted the Facebook page to your organization as well, so they can check you out. Rasan?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that can be done. And so I just dropped in the chat a Google Doc that leads to a change.org petition that was signed by over 50 Black-led organizations in Massachusetts. So you can sign that. It has a link to the change.org petition. But more importantly, it also has a link or information for individuals to call the conference committee. They're still debating these bills or working on reconciling this bill. So you can email the conference committee, and this Google Doc has the list of the conference committee members, as well as the Senate president and the Speaker of the House. There is a script or an email that you can cut and paste in there. Just make sure where it says enter your name, put your name, and don't leave enter your name there. And it says some of the high points for this legislation that need to be included. Then it has a script for you to call your legislator, your state representative and your state senator, as well as the Speaker of the House and the Senate president. And then some social media hashtags to use to really get engaged in the legislation that is happening here. That again, it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of the issues in policing, but it is harm reduction. And to the extent that we can put more constraints on policing, that gives us leverage to do some of the other things. I think mobilizing is key. Like Brother Brock was saying, get involved with these movements that are lifting up the narrative about what is actually happening in community, to push back against the faulty narrative of the valiant hero, which police are projected as. But when you talk to people in communities, over policed communities, you get a good sense of how policing happens so much differently, particularly in Black and Brown communities. And then educate yourself, right? There are a whole host of resources that are available online. There are books that you can read that tell the history of policing, that talk about racism within the criminal legal system, that talk about the structure of white supremacy and how that perpetuates racist and violent policing in communities of color. I think those are some of the ways that people can be most supportive. And then listen to Black folks. Like and other people of color, like when we're talking about our experience, please don't come with the yes but, or the well actually, and try to explain what's actually happening in the communities that are at the brunt of some of the most hostile and aggressive policing.
Thank you so much. I would like to, because we are running out of time and we want to be respectful of everyone's time, I would like to turn it over to Michael Hugo, who will read us some of the questions from the chat.
Thank you. So far, this discussion has been wonderful, and I want to thank all of our panelists. The first question is, how do we engage our own police force in Framingham? And when you're whoever's going to respond to this, I hope that you keep in mind that the Yuri Stamps case is, while it certainly is the most extreme case of police violence in Framingham, it's not the last case. And many of the same officers that were involved in that case were involved in the case that just came down from the SJC, in which a man of color was pulled out of his car and put his hands behind his back as a defensive move so that the police would cuff him and not beat him, and they proceeded to beat him almost to death. So with that in mind, how do we engage our own police force in Framingham in this vital and challenging and critical conversation? That's a toss-up question. Maybe I'm looking at Rasan's picture though, as I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities for folks to mobilize and engage. I think one thing is demanding information, right? Because without fail, law enforcement says we're not racist, we don't have systemic racism, or it's one bad apple or a few bad apples, but they forget the rest of the anecdote, which goes the few bad apples spoil the whole bunch. And it's really about the culture of policing. But one of the ways to get to the root of that is to get data. And so demand of the police department their data. What are the racial disparities, if any, in the stops that they make? What are the disparities in the arrests that they're making? Because if it is true, right, that they are not racist, that they are not engaged in racially disparate policing practices, then show the numbers. And and one of the things that will ultimately happen is they will explain it away and say, well, that's where the crime is. But if you get that data, you can make it public. Folks can reach out to the ACLU. We are endeavoring to get data from different police departments, and maybe we can help you get the data, or we can work with you to get it ourselves and make it public. And there are tons of researchers and analysts out there that can do the analysis. Back in 2014, the ACLU released a report called Black, Brown, and Targeted, and it showed that even though Black folks made up 24% of the city's population, they made up 63% of the people who were stopped. And even after the researchers controlled for crime, they still saw that there was significant disparities in who was stopped by the police. And so taking that information and making it public creates a different opportunity for a new conversation. And ultimately what comes out of that is the push for reforms at the municipal level. And I think that's something that's also important. One of the things that we did at the ACLU is push for a face surveillance moratorium. But we did it kind of on a municipal level. Northampton, Springfield, Brookline, Boston, each of these municipalities adopted a ban on police using this racist, unreliable technology. And now that's what's being considered in this state bill. So if there are things that folks want to mobilize around, like getting school resource officers out of their schools, that's something that's considered in this bill. If it passes, it leaves it up to the superintendent to get the school resource officers out of the schools. So those are some of the things that folks can do.
Okay, is there anybody else on the panel who'd like to speak to that question?
Absolutely. I would just like
I would
to
like to speak on that.
Sure, okay.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Mariah, you go first.
Yes. How can or what can you do? I just want to point out a couple of things that the Justice for Yuri Stamps is doing. And there's a petition out currently for Justice for Yuri Stamps, which I'll share in the chat to everyone. I just posted it. But then there's also the Justice for Yuri Stamps private Facebook page and group, where this information is being shared continuously as to what we're doing and moving forward. In January, we will be having a 10-year anniversary celebration of his, well, not celebration necessarily, but honoring of his life. in Boston. And so I wish for all of you to attend if you can. And lastly, there is a scholarship to keep my grandfather's legacy living through education for young students, which also gives them an opportunity to learn about his life, but also police brutality, just become more informed. And that's a scholarship that's going to be funded through or started through the Framingham School Department. And so if you wish to learn more about that, you can also put your email in the chat and we will get that information to you through the committee.
Some other things that you folks can do is that if there's not an issue in your community, there's Mass Action, you can join them. There's the ACLU, there's Refuse Fascism, there's Black Lives Matter. There are many organizations that are trying to move the needle on these issues. And you don't necessarily have to create one in your community. Find one that's close to your community and jump on board. You know, just, I say it over and over again, act like the Hardings.
Brock, before you start, let me just ask you to add a factor into your answer, which would be,
Sure.
how do we engage the police in education and thinking about reform and thinking about the reality of what's actually happening? I think you'd be the perfect guy.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to this because, I mean, if you notice, you know, some of the protests and some of the pictures of the protests, you'll see some protesters, you know, getting in shouting matches with the police that are standing there. And what we're trying to get people to consider is that what we're up against is not individual actions of the police, but we're up against an institution that's founded on racism, you know, that was founded on slavery. Slave patrols. I mean, definitely the Boston police has is part of that in its history. And so really, you know, the only way that we're going to get police behavior to change is not to try to reason with the police. They have to be told what to do. They're servants of the community. So really, it's more of a governmental type of, you know, a way I believe we need to approach it. But part of it too is, you know, what our task is, I believe, is we need to arouse and heighten the consciousness of the population. And principles of unity with Mass Action is to strengthen and develop the capacity of the community to organize and defend itself against you know, this violation of our rights. So part of this is, you know, when we took to the streets 6 years ago, we seriously meant it, that this is a new normal in this country. We're not going back to the days of old, to, you know, the preceding decades of complacency, of apathy, but that street protest is going to be a regular feature of American life, American culture, till we shake this foundation to its very roots, because that's how far deeply entrenched this problem goes. So just want people to consider how deep, you know, what you think is just some issue of police brutality can, you know, I don't believe you know, we have about, during that previous, it was hundreds of thousands. When George Floyd was killed, you know, now we're seeing millions on the streets. I believe we will see tens of millions on the streets before we see, you know, substantial progress on the situation. So our task is not really to try to convince the police, in my opinion. We need to convince each other about what the role of the police is, and we need to tell the government what to do and not let them try to explain away the status quo, which you know, the evidence is you know, mounting and undeniable at this point. And since there's more and more families speaking out too, that's a historical development. You know, I don't think there's any turning back. So I don't know if that helps answer it, but I say to say I don't believe there's an easy shortcut way to solve this problem.
Okay, and I just want to say one thing about when we did have our standout vigil in Framingham. The Framingham Police Department, for those who are here on this Zoom from Framingham and were not present that day, the Framingham Police Department was actually not only supportive, but was willing to close down streets if we had a larger crowd, if that's what it was going to take. They were extremely supportive. We have a new police chief in Framingham named Lester Baker.
Have developed. That's it.
Chief Baker, I think, is somebody who we will be approaching. I'm going to see if he'll drop in on one of our regular phone calls that we do, our weekly calls. He's an African-American gentleman who's been here his entire career and is a terrific choice, is what I'm told. The only thing I know about him is he's one of 2 police officers who ever stopped my wife for speeding. So, and he didn't give her a ticket, he gave her a warning. So we're on good terms. So we're going to be approaching him at some point to try to learn what his philosophy is on all of this, because I'm hoping that he'll take that leadership role that I'm counting on him to take with these issues in Framingham. All right, so the next question is, the trend has been in many communities to hire veterans with combat experience. Is that something we should be moving away from? I know, Brock, you're going to want to talk about that one. I could see you diving for the microphone. So why don't you take off, and then let's have somebody else after you.
Yeah, I mean, I believe in Worcester they had in the prisons some former people who were involved in Camp X-Ray. I can't see where that'd be a good background to bring into our domestic situation. But there's a case of Mary Holmes. She was beaten. She was assaulted by an MBTA transit officer around the time of Mike Brown, and she fought it, and she actually won. This was one of the few actually convictions of a police that we saw happen in Boston. Basically a slap on the wrist. She ended up maybe serving a couple months in jail, but this officer, her name escapes me right now, but she was a former combat veteran, and that was part of her argument to defend herself. Like, you know, she was more or less having a PTSD moment when she assaulted Mary Holmes. Luckily, it was caught on camera at the in Nubian Station. And but it was only because Mary Holmes was a very outspoken individual and fought on her own, very little help, that this became exposed. I believe maybe Rashawn could speak on this, because I know the ACLU got involved in this case.
Yeah, that's actually what happened. We represented.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and but really, I mean, without Mary's individual initiative, I don't know if it would have got, you know, to the ACLU's desk, you know. So anyways, you can speak more on it, but I know what Mary thinks about it. But in any case, I'll just leave it at that I don't think it's a good thing, but
yeah. And then I think Zeynep wanted to give us a quick.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. You know, yes, Mary Holmes definitely advocated and found some folks who could handle this matter for her. And the first thing was getting the criminal case dismissed, and that was some good attorneys who made sure that the prosecutor's office understood that what the police put in the police report was false, and then they saw the video. That's how the criminal matter ended up getting dismissed. And she also prevailed but we also brought forward a civil matter on her behalf to be compensated for the harm, and that matter was resolved as well. And then the DA's office, of its own accord, pursued criminal matters of the officer's name was Jennifer Garvey, who was a veteran. But so that's one thing, and I think there are issues around post-traumatic stress that show up within law enforcement. But the other issue is with Massachusetts civil service process, because it requires that disabled veterans and veterans go to the top of the list. So after everyone takes the exam, the civil service exam, to be considered to enter into police force training, then they take all of those scores in rank order and move all of the disabled veterans and veterans to the top of the list. And they, being at the top of the list, are the ones who get picked first. The logic behind it is that people who have been in these tense combat situations and have been trained in military order and discipline will somehow be better. But the problem is that that takes that occupied territory or takes the mentality of soldiers who have been in the theater of combat in some instances and deploys them into communities as if it is occupied territory. And officers that sometimes see themselves as the occupying force or patrolling force in communities, and that's never a good recipe. And again, when you think about the demographic makeups of these police departments in the communities that they are policing, particularly when it's significant numbers of people of color and people in low-income communities.
Thank you. Zeynep, I'm willing to bet that you have a whole section in your course on this very topic.
Yeah, militarization of police, right? Yeah, there's a section that we spend on this, but yeah, it goes along with what Rashan was saying in terms of how, if you bring in people who are trained to combat enemies and bring in to have them deal with citizens, then you are actually playing with a really dangerous weapon. And actually the whole issue of militarization of police is not only about weapons and tactics that we are bringing into the police force that is more militarizing and making it much more aggressive towards the populations, but also I guess these kinds of things are also happening. I didn't know about the Massachusetts specific case, but it is alongside what is going on in the United States since 1990s especially, but before then it starts in the 1960s, 70s, the way in which police organizations have been buffed up and became more and more aggressive through the militarized techniques and equipment and also trainings, which now apparently includes people who have been working as in the army against enemies. So I think it's a dangerous and important element that we have to also pay attention to and fight against if we want less brutal police and more softer policing, I guess.
Thank you. The next one is actually aimed directly at you, Zeynep, also. Could you elaborate on some of the countries specifically that exercise less force vis-a-vis police brutality? You're muted.
Okay, this is less force against civilians, I guess, right? Yeah. So obviously, if you want less force on police brutality for police to use, and it really requires police accountability and justice in the case of police use of force. And many countries which might have less police brutality are also the countries which might have better systems in place that put police accountable. But also there are many countries, especially in Europe again, that don't have too much reliance on weapons and that has trainings that have less focus on violence and aggression, but more on the de-escalation. So these are the things that can create less police abuse of power and brutality. But I think more important than this is the presence of accountability measures that are really taken seriously, that your criminal justice system responds to, or the police organization itself has internal mechanisms to deal with. There are these options here, but they seem to not work very well. Either the police cover-ups or the city governments, and then the criminal justice system does not respond, then further escalating and further making sure that police brutality continues to happen. Specific cases I couldn't give, but I also would like to again go back to the idea of where in those countries where there are other kinds of ways of dealing with social issues other than police. When you have more education and more social services, more community resources, then there is less need for police brutality either. So I think we shouldn't we shouldn't lose sight of that. You know, it is not just about training, it's not just about the accountability afterwards, but how are you managing your society? How are you creating opportunities for your communities? How are you treating your communities in general is also indicative of how then you, have your police officers treat your community as well, I think.
Thank you so much. Before I kick this back to Selvin to close it up, one of the things that we've learned tonight is that this is an issue of tremendous interest to people in this area all over all over the country. But we actually were oversubscribed by about 30 or 40 people. And so that's why we had to pour it out to Facebook. And I am going to be sure that we continue this dialogue. And perhaps I'm going to suggest to the committee when we have our next meeting that we schedule another one of these sessions for sometime after the first of the year. And I wanted, for people who are in Framingham, I want to let you know that in case you haven't heard it yet, if you must be under a rock if you haven't, but the Framingham Democratic Committee is taking on the whole issue of social injustice, social and racial justice and equity. Rosamond Hooper Hammersley, who is on the screen here, is heading it up for us. And I invite people to participate in our programming that will start I'm thinking probably the month of February will be when we roll into it, although we've actually begun already with some resolutions. So stay tuned, participate. I know that the League of Women Voters, Stephanie Deely, is here on the line, and she has indicated an interest in working with us. But we will be bringing another forum like this back to Zoom, and we will subscribe for the bigger package, right, Ashley, for that night, so that we can accommodate everybody. And thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Selvin now. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here with us tonight. And I really want to thank Mass Action and ACLU for partnering with us. I want to thank our panelists for being here. I also want to thank Dr. Sanchez Connolly for helping to facilitate this conversation. And the reality for us all is that this is a conversation, and every conversation should take action. Everyone's not going to agree. I'm watching the chats and people have difference of opinions of different things. That is okay. That's the beauty of this country. But what we really have to do is get at the root of this issue of systemic racism, which nobody can deny, right? We have to get at the root of police brutality. We have to get at the root of social injustice. And there's a call of action for all of us, right? It doesn't make a difference what your nationality, your race, your gender, what your beliefs are. It's really important that we take action in some form, whether it's in your community, whether it's joining a group. And if you don't have the time, sometimes you can donate money to a cause. But really what's important is action, volunteerism, and people taking it to the streets. And then how do we then move from protest to policy? So beautiful people, as I said before, those go hand in hand. So thank you, have a good evening, and please be on the lookout for some more opportunities to be engaged with Justice for Yuri Stamps. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Hey, thanks.
Good night.
Thanks for joining. Good night, everyone.
Check out Mass Action Podcast this Friday.
If panelists would like to hang on just for a second, maybe we could just have a quick
Sure
chat.
thing. What were you saying, Brock?
Good night, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Okay. We can talk later. Thanks, everyone.
Brock?
Oh, yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. I've been on Zoom since 9:30 this
No.
I don't know who's talking.
By 30 minutes, actually.
You're in Ariel or in the building.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Ashley, if you want to just, you can go to the participant thing and you can just X people off.
It looks like everyone's Xing themselves. Let's see. Give me 1 second.
Did we lose Selvin?
I'll text them to come back.
I can.
And then do we want to stop the Facebook feed?
No. Yes, you stop the Facebook feed and I'll stop the recording.
I'm not sure I know how.